At my husband's promotion party, I overheard him telling his colleagues that I was just a burden he had to drag along to corporate events because I didn't understand business. What he didn't know was that I owned 62% of the company he was so proud to work for, and his boss was about to make that very clear to everyone in the room. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The crystal chandelier above the ballroom cast fractured light across 300 faces. All of them turned toward my husband as he accepted congratulations for his promotion to Senior Vice President of Operations at Meridian Global Industries. I stood near the bar, watching Daniel navigate the crowd with the practiced ease of someone who belonged in these circles, who understood the unspoken rules of corporate power, and knew exactly how to leverage them for personal advancement. He looked every inch the successful executive in his tailored Brioni suit, the one I had suggested he purchase from the private tailor in Milan during what he believed was a vacation funded by his generous bonus. The truth about where that money actually originated would soon become impossible for him to ignore. I had arrived at the promotion party an hour earlier, deliberately choosing to enter through the main doors rather than accompanying Daniel during his grand entrance. He had asked me to arrive separately, explaining that it would look better if he entered alone, projecting the image of a self-made man who had climbed the corporate ladder through pure merit and determination. I had agreed without argument, accustomed to accommodating his preferences about how we should appear in public. For 7 years, I had perfected the role of the supportive wife who remained slightly in the background, present enough to fulfill social obligations but never prominent enough to draw attention away from Daniel's carefully constructed narrative of individual achievement. The venue itself spoke of corporate excess and celebration. The Peninsula Hotel's grand ballroom had been transformed into a showcase of Meridian's success, with enormous screens displaying the company's quarterly achievements, market expansion, and strategic initiatives. Servers circulated with champagne and elaborate hors d'oeuvres, while a jazz quartet provided sophisticated background music. The guest list included Meridian's entire executive leadership team, the board of directors, major clients, and selected employees from Daniel's division. Everyone who mattered in his professional world had gathered to celebrate his ascension to the senior leadership ranks. I had positioned myself strategically near the bar, close enough to observe but far enough to avoid immediate inclusion in the congratulatory conversation surrounding Daniel. From this vantage point, I could watch him work the room, shaking hands with board members, laughing at jokes from the chief executive officer, and accepting praise from colleagues who viewed his promotion as well-deserved recognition of his contributions to the company's operational excellence. He had prepared for this moment meticulously, rehearsing talking points about his achievements and strategizing about which relationships to prioritize during the evening's networking opportunities. What Daniel did not know, what he had never suspected during our entire marriage, was that the company celebrating his success was not simply his employer but my legacy. Meridian Global Industries had been founded by my grandfather 40 years earlier, built from a small manufacturing operation into an international conglomerate, with divisions spanning technology, logistics, and industrial production. When my father died 5 years ago, controlling interest in the company had passed to me through a trust structure so complex that even most board members did not fully understand the ownership arrangement. The public-facing narrative described Meridian as owned by an investment consortium, with management operating independently under the guidance of the board of directors. The reality was that I held 62% of the company's shares through layered trusts and holding companies, giving me ultimate control over every significant decision, including executive appointments and promotions. I had hidden this ownership from Daniel deliberately, with careful planning that began before we even met. After watching my mother endure a marriage where she could never be certain whether her husband loved her or her family's wealth, I had determined to build relationships based on authentic connection, rather than financial attraction. When I met Daniel at a charity fundraiser 7 years ago, I introduced myself as Sophia Bennett, a freelance event coordinator who helped nonprofits with their fundraising campaigns. The name was my legal name, though I used my mother's maiden name Bennett rather than my father's surname Harrison, which appeared on corporate documents and society pages. The profession was partially true, as I did volunteer with several charitable organizations, though my actual days were spent in strategic planning meetings and financial analysis sessions with Meridian's executive team, attending via video conference from locations Daniel assumed were client offices for my small event planning business. The dual identity had required extraordinary discipline to maintain. I kept separate phone lines for personal and business communications, maintained different email addresses that Daniel never saw, and scheduled all significant business activities during hours when he was at work or traveling. The corporate leadership team knew my true identity, though they had been instructed to maintain absolute confidentiality and to never acknowledge me if our paths crossed in Daniel's presence. My assistant Rebecca managed the complex logistics of my double life, coordinating schedules to ensure I could attend both board meetings and dinner parties without creating suspicious gaps in my supposed event planning activities. Watching Daniel now, I remembered the man I had fallen in love with 7 years earlier. He had seemed different then, or perhaps I had simply been more willing to overlook warning signs that became impossible to ignore over time. During our courtship, he had been attentive and romantic, interested in my thoughts and opinions, supportive of what he believed was my small business helping nonprofits. He had proposed after 18 months with a heartfelt speech about building a life together based on partnership and mutual respect. I had accepted, believing I had finally found someone who valued me for myself rather than for the corporate empire I secretly controlled. The change had been gradual, almost imperceptible at first. As Daniel's career at Meridian advanced, he became increasingly focused on professional achievement and decreasingly interested in my perspectives or activities. Conversations that once ranged across literature, travel, and philosophy narrowed to focus almost exclusively on his work challenges and career strategies. My supposed event planning business, which he had initially praised as meaningful charitable work, became something he referenced with barely concealed condescension, the hobby of a woman who did not understand real business or significant professional achievement. Before we continue with this story of hidden power and ultimate revelation, I want to invite you to join this community of people who believe that authentic worth deserves recognition, regardless of how carefully it has been concealed. If you value stories about reclaiming your power and revealing truth at the perfect moment, please consider subscribing to this channel. Supporting this content helps us share more narratives about people who found the courage to step out of the shadows and claim their rightful place. It is free and helps these stories reach others who need to hear them. The turning point in my perception of our marriage had come 3 months earlier during a dinner party at our home. I had spent the afternoon preparing a meal from scratch, something I enjoyed doing despite having the resources to hire any level of catering service. Daniel had invited several colleagues, including his direct supervisor Robert Chun, and 2 other vice presidents from Meridian's operations division. During dinner, the conversation had turned to a significant logistics challenge the company was facing with its European distribution network. I had offered a suggestion based on my detailed knowledge of the company's infrastructure, carefully framed as an outsider's perspective rather than insider information. The solution I proposed was sophisticated and would have saved the company millions in inefficiencies. Daniel had laughed dismissively, patting my hand in a gesture that appeared affectionate but felt patronizing. He told his colleagues that I tried to understand business concepts, but lacked the background to grasp the complexities of international operations. Robert Chun had looked uncomfortable, clearly recognizing that my suggestion had merit but unwilling to contradict his subordinate in a social setting. The other executives had smiled politely and changed the subject, leaving my proposal hanging in the air, acknowledged by no one despite its obvious value. Later that evening, after the guests had departed, I had mentioned to Daniel that his dismissal had felt hurtful. He had responded with what he clearly believed was reassuring patience, explaining that he understood I wanted to contribute to conversations about his work, but that I should recognize the limitations of my knowledge and stick to topics I actually understood, like party planning and charitable events. The conversation had been brief and completely one-sided, with Daniel apparently convinced he was being kind by explaining reality rather than cruel by diminishing my intelligence and expertise. That night marked the beginning of my documentation project. I began quietly recording instances where Daniel dismissed my contributions, minimized my intelligence, or portrayed me as less capable than I actually was. I saved text messages where he made jokes about my supposed naivety about business. I kept notes of conversations where he explained basic concepts to me that I had actually mastered years earlier during my business education and subsequent leadership of a multi-billion-dollar corporation. The evidence file grew steadily, a catalog of casual cruelty delivered with smiles and condescension, rather than obvious malice. Standing in the ballroom now, I watched Daniel excuse himself from a conversation with several board members and move toward a quieter corner near the windows overlooking the city. 3 of his colleagues followed him, men I recognized from various company events and functions. I moved closer, using a large floral arrangement as partial cover, positioning myself where I could hear their conversation without being immediately visible. The discussion began with standard congratulations and speculation about Daniel's future trajectory within the company. Then one of the colleagues, James Patterson from the finance division, asked the question that would change everything. He wanted to know how Daniel managed the balance between his demanding career and his personal life, particularly given the time commitments required at the senior vice president level. Daniel's response came easily, rehearsed from previous similar conversations I had apparently not been present to witness. He explained that his wife was supportive in her own way, but that I did not really understand the pressures of his position or the complexity of corporate leadership. He described me as someone content with small-scale charitable work who was happy to attend company events, but who contributed little to his professional life beyond basic social support. The characterization was delivered without malice, simply factual description of what he perceived as reality. James laughed and mentioned that at least Daniel did not have to worry about a wife with her own demanding career creating scheduling conflicts or competing priorities. Daniel agreed, noting that my flexible event planning schedule meant I could always accommodate his needs, attending functions when required and staying home when more convenient. He described this arrangement as ideal for someone at his level, allowing him to focus entirely on his career, without the complications that arose when both spouses had serious professional ambitions. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The third colleague, Michael Torres from operations, asked whether I ever felt like a burden, given that Daniel clearly had to bring me to events like tonight's celebration, even though I could not fully appreciate or contribute to the professional context. The question was asked with genuine curiosity rather than intentional cruelty, the casual inquiry of someone who had never considered that his words might be hurtful, or that the woman being discussed might possess capabilities beyond what was immediately apparent. Daniel's answer drove the air from my lungs despite the fact that I had been preparing for exactly this kind of revelation for months. He said that yes, sometimes bringing me to corporate events did feel like a burden because I required basic explanation of context and concepts that everyone else in the room understood intuitively. He compared it to bringing a child to an adult gathering, where you had to constantly monitor and manage their participation to prevent embarrassment. The metaphor was delivered with a slight laugh, as though the burden was minor and manageable, an acceptable cost of maintaining appearances and social obligations. The 3 colleagues chuckled in what seemed like sympathetic understanding, each of them apparently relating to the challenge of managing less sophisticated spouses in professional contexts. The conversation continued for several more minutes, with Daniel offering advice about maintaining appropriate boundaries between professional and personal life, ensuring that a spouse's limitations did not interfere with career advancement. He positioned himself as someone who had successfully navigated this challenge, maintaining a stable home life while ensuring that his wife's lack of business acumen did not impede his professional reputation. I remained behind the floral arrangement, my hands gripping my champagne glass with enough force that I feared it might shatter. 7 years of careful concealment, of playing a role designed to test whether Daniel could love me for myself rather than for my wealth and power, had led to this moment. The test had produced definitive results. My husband did not simply fail to recognize my capabilities. He actively believed I possessed none. The woman he had married was, in his perception, a pleasant but limited individual whose primary value lay in not interfering with his ambitions rather than in contributing meaningfully to any shared life or purpose. The evidence I had been gathering for 3 months suddenly seemed inadequate, too abstract and documentary in nature. What I needed was something more immediate and undeniable, a revelation that would occur in front of witnesses who could not later claim misunderstanding or misinterpretation. The promotion party, I realized, presented the perfect opportunity. Everyone who mattered in Daniel's professional world was gathered in this room. The setting was formal and public, with the company's leadership team present and attentive. Most importantly, Daniel was at the peak of his confidence, celebrating what he believed was a triumph earned through individual merit and unstoppable competence. I moved away from the floral arrangement and made my way toward the ballroom's side exit, pulling out my phone to send a carefully worded text message to Catherine Morrison, Meridian's chief executive officer and the person who reported directly to the board of directors, which meant she reported ultimately to me. The message was brief and clear. I indicated that I was ready to move forward with the revelation we had discussed during our confidential meeting 2 weeks earlier. Catherine had initially counseled patience, suggesting that public disclosure of my ownership might create complications better avoided. I had convinced her that the time had come for truth, that continuing to hide my identity served no purpose beyond enabling Daniel's delusions and protecting him from consequences he had earned through his own choices and attitudes. Catherine's response came within 90 seconds. She confirmed that she understood and would coordinate with Robert Chen, who as Daniel's direct supervisor would play a crucial role in the upcoming revelation. She asked whether I was absolutely certain about proceeding, noting that once this particular door was opened, it could not be closed again. I confirmed my decision without hesitation. 7 years was long enough to hide. 7 years was more than enough time for Daniel to demonstrate whether he could value a partner for her character and intelligence, rather than for her obedience and convenience. I returned to the ballroom and positioned myself near the front, close to the small stage where speakers had been delivering remarks throughout the evening. Daniel was now in conversation with several board members, his body language radiating confidence and satisfaction. He caught my eye across the room and offered a small smile that was probably meant to be affectionate but read as tolerant, the expression of someone acknowledging a responsibility they had not asked for but accepted with reasonable grace. Catherine Morrison moved to the microphone on the stage, her presence commanding immediate attention from the assembled guests. She was an impressive figure, a woman in her mid-50s who had risen through Meridian's ranks over 3 decades to reach the chief executive position 5 years ago. I had appointed her to the role shortly after assuming control of the company following my father's death, recognizing her combination of operational excellence and ethical leadership. She knew every detail of my situation with Daniel, having watched the relationship deteriorate from promising partnership into one-sided arrangement, where I played a supporting role in someone else's narrative of success. Catherine began her remarks by thanking everyone for attending the celebration and noting the significance of Daniel's promotion to the senior vice president level. She outlined his accomplishments over his 7 years with the company, the improvements he had driven in operational efficiency, the cost reductions he had identified, and the process innovations he had implemented. The achievements were real and substantial. Daniel was genuinely skilled at his work, which made his personal failings more rather than less disappointing. A less competent man might have been easier to dismiss as simply inadequate across all dimensions. Daniel's professional excellence made his personal blindness and casual cruelty more striking by contrast. After completing her overview of Daniel's professional contributions, Catherine paused and her expression shifted from celebratory to more serious. She noted that Meridian Global Industries had been built on principles of respect, recognition of talent regardless of its source, and the understanding that true leadership required humility about how much any individual actually accomplished alone versus with support from others whose contributions might be less visible, but no less essential. The room grew quieter, guests sensing that something unexpected was about to unfold. Daniel looked slightly confused but not yet concerned, apparently assuming that Catherine was simply transitioning into more philosophical remarks about leadership and organizational culture. He could not yet imagine that his personal life was about to become the subject of public discussion and revelation. Catherine continued by noting that every person's success rested on foundations they might not fully recognize or appreciate. She spoke about how easy it became for successful individuals to forget the support structures that enabled their achievements, to attribute outcomes entirely to their own efforts while overlooking the contributions of partners, colleagues, and institutions. The words were general enough that many guests probably assumed she was simply offering wisdom about gratitude and perspective, standard fare for corporate celebrations. Then her tone sharpened and became more specific. She said that sometimes the support enabling someone's success came from sources so hidden that the beneficiary remained entirely unaware of their existence. She noted that this ignorance, while perhaps understandable, could lead to attitudes and behaviors that would be mortifying if the truth were known. The room was completely silent now, 300 people focused entirely on Catherine's words, and trying to understand where this unexpected turn was leading. She looked directly at Daniel, who had gone very still, his expression shifting from confusion toward something approaching concern. Catherine stated that she wanted to take a moment to acknowledge someone whose contribution to Meridian Global Industries and to many people's careers had been profound but largely unrecognized, because that person had chosen to remain in the background. She said that this individual had made personal sacrifices to allow others to shine, had hidden their own light to test whether they would be valued for themselves rather than for their position and resources. My heart was racing, but I kept my expression neutral and my posture relaxed. Several people near me glanced in my direction, perhaps sensing from Catherine's gaze that I was somehow relevant to whatever was unfolding. Daniel was looking around the room now, clearly trying to understand what was happening and why his celebration had taken this strange turn. Catherine finally spoke the words that would change everything. She explained that Meridian Global Industries, the company we were all celebrating tonight, the organization that employed everyone in this room and had just promoted Daniel to senior leadership, was not owned by a faceless investment consortium as most people assumed. Instead, controlling interest, specifically 62% of all shares, was held by a single individual who had inherited the company from her father 5 years earlier. This owner had chosen to remain anonymous, to allow management to operate with apparent independence, and to evaluate people based on their character and capability, rather than on their relationship to corporate power. She paused, allowing the information to register. Several board members were nodding, apparently already aware of what was about to be revealed. Robert Chun was watching Daniel with an expression of deep discomfort, clearly recognizing that his subordinate was about to experience a moment of profound shock and humiliation. Then Catherine spoke my name. She identified me as Sophia Harrison, majority shareholder and ultimate controlling authority of Meridian Global Industries. She explained that I had been present at countless corporate functions over the years, always introduced simply as Daniel Chen's wife, my actual identity and position known only to the most senior leadership. She noted that I had chosen this anonymity deliberately, for personal reasons that were my own business, but that the time had come for truth to be acknowledged publicly. The room erupted in shocked murmurs and exclamations. Heads swiveled in my direction, 300 pairs of eyes suddenly seeing me not as Daniel's pleasant but unremarkable wife, but as the person who actually controlled the entire organization. Daniel's face had gone completely white, his mouth opening and closing without producing sound. He looked like someone who had just discovered that gravity worked differently than he had always assumed, that fundamental rules of reality were not what he believed them to be. I remained where I was standing, meeting Catherine's gaze across the room and offering her a small nod of acknowledgement and appreciation. Then I looked at Daniel, really looked at him, and saw the moment of recognition dawn in his eyes. He understood suddenly and completely that every conversation where he had dismissed my intelligence, every instance where he had described me as a burden, every time he had portrayed me as someone who did not understand business had been delivered to the woman who actually owned the company he worked for, and who had enabled every success he had ever achieved within it. The champagne glass in my hand was steady now. No trembling, no uncertainty. 7 years of hiding had led to this moment of revelation, and the feeling flooding through me was not triumph or vindication but something simpler and more profound. It was relief. Relief at finally being seen completely, at no longer maintaining the exhausting performance of being less than I actually was. Whatever happened next, whatever consequences followed from this public revelation, at least I would face them as my authentic self rather than as a character in someone else's comfortable narrative. The silence following Catherine's revelation lasted perhaps 15 seconds, though it felt substantially longer as 300 people processed information that fundamentally altered their understanding of the evening's dynamics. Then the room erupted into conversation, voices rising in overlapping waves of shock, curiosity, and urgent speculation. I remained standing near the front of the ballroom, aware of the attention now focused entirely on me, but choosing to maintain composure rather than react to the sudden shift in how I was being perceived. Daniel had not moved from his position near the board members, though the executives who had been congratulating him moments earlier had subtly shifted their body language, creating physical distance that reflected their sudden uncertainty about how to interact with someone whose wife had just been revealed as their ultimate employer. His face had progressed from white to a dull red. and his hands were clenched at his sides in a posture that suggested he was using considerable effort to maintain outward control while his internal state approached panic. Catherine allowed the reaction to continue for approximately 30 seconds before raising her hand to request attention. The conversations died down gradually as guests recognized that more information was forthcoming. She continued her remarks by explaining that my decision to maintain anonymity had been personal and deliberate, driven by experiences that had taught me the value of being known for one's character, rather than one's financial position. She noted that this choice had required extraordinary discipline, and had been supported by only a small circle of senior leaders who understood the reasoning and respected the boundary. The explanation was tactful and revealed nothing about my relationship with Daniel, or the specific reasons my anonymity had extended even into my marriage. Catherine was protecting my privacy while simultaneously making clear that the secrecy had been intentional rather than accidental, a choice I had made rather than a situation that had simply evolved without conscious direction. The distinction was important because it established that I had been in control of information flow rather than simply ignorant of my own significance. She then transitioned to describing my actual role within Meridian Global Industries, information that would help the assembled guests understand the depth of knowledge and involvement I had maintained despite my public invisibility. She explained that I attended all board meetings, though typically via secure video connection, rather than in person to maintain separation between my corporate role and my public identity as Daniel's wife. She noted that I reviewed all major strategic decisions, approved executive appointments at the vice president level and above, and maintained detailed understanding of operational performance across all company divisions. The revelation that I had approved Daniel's promotion to senior vice president hung in the air with obvious implications. Every person in the room understood immediately that the man who had described his wife as a burden incapable of understanding business had actually been promoted by that same wife, who not only understood business but controlled the entire organization he worked within. The irony was so profound that several people glanced at Daniel with expressions mixing sympathy and barely concealed amusement at his predicament. Catherine concluded her remarks by stating that she was honored to work for someone who led with integrity and wisdom, who made decisions based on merit rather than personal relationships, and who had built Meridian into an industry leader through strategic vision and commitment to excellence. The description was generous but accurate. I had worked extraordinarily hard during my 5 years of majority ownership to honor my father's legacy, while also modernizing the company's approach to sustainability, workforce development, and technological innovation. The company's success was not simply inherited momentum, but the result of deliberate choices and strategic investments I had personally championed. When Catherine stepped away from the microphone, the room remained silent for a moment before Robert Chen, Daniel's direct supervisor, began to applaud. The gesture was diplomatic and appropriate, acknowledging the revelation while also moving past the shock toward some semblance of normal social interaction. Others joined the applause gradually, though the response was more polite than enthusiastic, with many guests clearly still processing the implications of what they had learned. I acknowledged the applause with a slight nod, recognizing the social necessity of the gesture, while also understanding that genuine acceptance of my revealed identity would take considerably longer than a few moments of polite clapping. These people had known me for years as Daniel's unremarkable wife, someone peripheral to their professional concerns. Adjusting to seeing me as the person who actually controlled their careers and the company's direction would require substantial mental recalibration that could not happen instantly regardless of how clear the facts might be. Daniel finally moved, walking toward me with steps that appeared carefully controlled, as though he was concentrating on each footfall to prevent stumbling. When he reached me, he stopped at a distance that was closer than strangers would stand but farther than spouses typically position themselves, his uncertainty about appropriate proximity obvious in his hesitation. His face was still flushed, and his eyes held an expression I had never seen before, something combining shock, humiliation, and what might have been the beginning of genuine fear about consequences. He opened his mouth to speak, closed it again, then finally managed to produce words in a voice barely above a whisper. He asked whether what Catherine had said was actually true, whether I really owned the majority of Meridian Global Industries. The question was almost absurd given the setting and the source of the information, but I recognized it as the desperate inquiry of someone hoping that reality might somehow be different than it appeared. that there might be some explanation or qualification that would make the situation less catastrophic to his ego and his carefully constructed self-image. I confirmed the truth simply and directly. I told him that yes, I was Sophia Harrison, that I had inherited controlling interest in Meridian from my father 5 years ago, and that I had been managing the company's strategic direction throughout our marriage while allowing him to believe I was simply a freelance event coordinator with minimal understanding of business operations. I delivered this information in a calm, even tone without anger or vindictiveness, simply stating facts that happened to completely upend his understanding of our relationship and my capabilities. Daniel's next question came after a visible struggle to formulate coherent thought. He asked why I had hidden this from him, why I had allowed him to believe something fundamentally false about who I was and what I was capable of. The hurt in his voice was genuine, though whether he was wounded by the deception itself or simply by the blow to his ego remained unclear. I suspected it was primarily the latter, that his pain stemmed more from recognition of how foolish he now appeared than from betrayal of trust in our relationship. I explained that when we met 7 years earlier, I had been recovering from a previous relationship where the man had been interested primarily in my family's wealth and corporate position rather than in me as an individual. I told him that I had wanted to build something authentic, to be certain that any partner who claimed to love me was responding to my actual character rather than to the resources and power I could provide. I noted that hiding my identity had been the only way I could think to test whether genuine connection was possible, whether someone could value me for qualities beyond my inheritance and position. The explanation was truthful as far as it went, though it omitted the more painful realization that had emerged over our 7 years together. I had not simply been testing whether Daniel could love me without knowing about my wealth and power. I had also been discovering whether he could respect me, whether he could recognize intelligence and capability even when those qualities came without obvious credentials or institutional authority. He had failed that test far more comprehensively than I had anticipated when I first conceived of this extended experiment in authentic relationship. Daniel processed this information with visible difficulty, his expression shifting through several emotions in rapid succession. He seemed to land finally on anger, asking how I could have deceived him so completely for so long, how I could have allowed him to make a fool of himself by explaining business concepts to me that I apparently understood better than he did. The focus on his embarrassment rather than on any broader implications of what my deception revealed about our relationship dynamic was telling. Even in this moment of revelation, his primary concern remained his own image and reputation rather than the health of our marriage or the reasons I might have felt such elaborate concealment was necessary. I responded that I had never asked him to explain things to me, that I had never pretended ignorance or requested tutorials on subjects I already understood. His habit of explaining had emerged from his own assumptions about my capabilities based on my supposed profession and my choice to remain somewhat quiet in corporate settings. I noted that I had often offered insights or suggestions that demonstrated sophisticated understanding, but that he had consistently dismissed or overlooked those contributions because they did not align with his preconceived notions about what someone like me should be capable of knowing. This observation appeared to strike him with particular force, perhaps because it required him to recognize his own role in constructing the false narrative he had been living within. It was easier to be angry at me for hiding than to acknowledge that he had actively participated in maintaining his own ignorance through systematic dismissal of evidence that contradicted his preferred understanding of our respective capabilities and worth. Several guests had moved closer during our conversation, not near enough to hear our specific words but close enough to observe our interaction and likely guess at the general content of our discussion. I was aware of being watched by 300 people who were all undoubtedly fascinated by this unexpected drama, unfolding at what was supposed to be a straightforward celebration of corporate achievement. The attention was uncomfortable but also oddly liberating. After 7 years of careful concealment, of monitoring every word and action to maintain my cover, there was something freeing about being fully visible even if that visibility came with inevitable judgment and speculation. Robert Chun approached us with the careful demeanor of someone navigating a social minefield. He addressed me formally as Miss Harrison, a notable change from the casual greeting he had always used with Daniel's wife Sophia. He expressed appreciation for my years of leadership, and noted that Meridian had flourished under my ownership. The comments were diplomatic and appropriate, though they also served to underscore Daniel's new reality. His direct supervisor was now treating his wife with obvious deference, acknowledging a power dynamic that placed me far above Robert's own position in the organizational hierarchy, despite my lack of formal title or public role. Robert then mentioned that several board members hoped to speak with me before the evening concluded, noting that my public revelation would necessitate some adjustments to how board meetings and communications were handled going forward. The practical implications of my exposure were beginning to emerge. Maintaining anonymity had required complex logistical arrangements that could now be simplified. But the simplification would come at the cost of privacy I had valued and protected for years. I thanked Robert for the information and confirmed that I would be available to speak with board members before leaving the event. Daniel stood beside me during this exchange, effectively invisible despite being the nominal center of the evening's celebration. His promotion, which should have been the focus of attention and conversation, had been completely overshadowed by the revelation about his wife's true identity. The shift from celebrated executive to footnote in someone else's dramatic story was nearly complete, accomplished in less than 15 minutes through information that had always been true, but had simply been unknown to most of the people in the room. After Robert stepped away, Daniel made another attempt to process what was happening. He asked whether I had been involved in his hiring 7 years earlier, whether our entire relationship had been some kind of elaborate corporate scheme. The question revealed how completely his understanding of reality had been disrupted. He was now questioning whether anything he believed about our history was accurate, whether the foundation of our marriage had been authentic connection or calculated manipulation. I explained that we had met genuinely by chance at the charity fundraiser, that I had no involvement in his initial hiring at Meridian, which had occurred through normal recruitment processes several months before we met. I noted that I had not even known he worked for my company until our third date, when he mentioned his employer during conversation about his career. At that point I had faced a choice about whether to reveal my identity or continue the concealment I had already established. I had chosen continued anonymity, curious to see how the relationship would develop without the complication of him knowing about my ownership position. This explanation seemed to provide Daniel with some relief, as though confirmation that our meeting had been accidental made the subsequent deception somehow less total. He asked whether I had influenced his career progression, whether his promotions and achievements had been based on merit or on his relationship with me. The question was inevitable and also cut to the heart of his professional self-concept. If his success had been manufactured rather than earned, then the identity he had built around being an exceptional performer would be revealed as equally false as his understanding of his wife's capabilities. I assured him that I had deliberately maintained strict separation between our personal relationship and his professional evaluation. I explained that I had recused myself from any direct decisions about his career, that his promotions had been recommended by supervisors based on his actual performance and approved by board committees that evaluated candidates without any input from me about my personal connection to him. His success at Meridian was legitimate, earned through his own competence and hard work rather than through spousal influence. The reassurance appeared to matter to him significantly, suggesting that his professional identity remained more central to his self-concept than our relationship did. He seemed more concerned with protecting his reputation as a talented executive than with understanding why his wife had felt it necessary to hide her true self for 7 years. The priorities revealed in this moment of crisis were illuminating in ways that made me question why I had invested so much effort in testing whether authentic connection was possible with someone who fundamentally valued achievement and status above relationship and mutual understanding. Catherine Morrison joined our conversation, her presence immediately shifting the dynamic through the authority she carried as Chief Executive Officer. She addressed Daniel directly, noting that this was obviously a difficult situation, and offering to arrange a private space if he and I needed to continue our discussion away from the public setting. The offer was considerate and also provided an exit route from the ballroom that would allow Daniel to escape the watching eyes of 300 colleagues and clients who had just witnessed his public humbling. Daniel declined the offer with visible effort at maintaining composure. He stated that he needed some time to process what he had learned, and that he thought it would be better if we spoke later at home, rather than attempting serious conversation in the current environment. The decision showed more wisdom than I had expected, recognizing that he was too emotional and shocked to engage productively, and that continuing to talk in the ballroom would only provide additional entertainment for assembled guests who were already undoubtedly speculating about the state of our marriage and the dynamics that had led to such dramatic public revelation. I agreed to the suggestion of postponing detailed discussion, internally recognizing that any conversation we had tonight would be dominated by his shock and anger rather than by genuine examination of the relationship patterns that had made my concealment feel necessary. The morning would bring more clarity and perhaps more capacity for honest reflection about how we had arrived at this moment, and whether anything remained worth preserving from 7 years of marriage built partially on deception, but also on genuine moments of connection that had existed before his dismissiveness became the dominant pattern. Daniel moved away after this exchange, walking toward the ballroom exit with shoulders slightly hunched and gait less confident than the triumphant stride he had displayed earlier in the evening. Several colleagues attempted to engage him as he passed, but he deflected their attention with minimal responses and continued toward the door. I watched him leave and felt a complex mixture of emotions that included residual affection, disappointment, and something approaching grief for the relationship I had hoped we might have, but which had clearly never developed into the partnership I had imagined during our early years together. With Daniel's departure, the evening's dynamic shifted again. I was no longer simply the source of dramatic revelation but became once more a person to be engaged with, though now from an entirely different position in the social hierarchy. Board members approached to express their appreciation for my leadership and to discuss practical implications of my public exposure. Several asked thoughtful questions about how I wanted to handle communications about the ownership revelation, whether I intended to take on more public visibility going forward, and how the transition from anonymous owner to acknowledged leader should be managed to minimize disruption to company operations. The conversations were professionally oriented and surprisingly comfortable given the dramatic circumstances that had prompted them. These were people who understood corporate dynamics and power structures, who could separate the personal drama of my marriage from the business implications of my revealed identity. They treated me as they always should have, as an intelligent and capable leader whose judgment had guided the company successfully for 5 years. And there was something deeply satisfying about finally being able to interact authentically, rather than through the careful performance I had maintained for so long. Rebecca, my assistant who had managed the complex logistics of my double life for years, appeared at my elbow during a brief pause in the conversations. She asked quietly whether I was managing the situation adequately, or whether I needed any support or intervention. Her concern was genuine and touching, reflecting our relationship which had always been based on mutual respect and clear understanding of the challenges inherent in maintaining such elaborate concealment. I assured her that I was managing appropriately and thanked her for her years of discretion and competence in helping maintain the separation between my public and private identities. I noted that her job would become significantly easier going forward now that the secret was revealed, though we would need to discuss how various practical arrangements should be adjusted to reflect my new public visibility. She smiled with obvious relief, acknowledging that while she had understood and supported my reasons for anonymity, the constant vigilance required to prevent accidental exposure had been exhausting. As the evening progressed toward its conclusion, guests began departing with expressions of appreciation for the unexpected drama that had transformed what might have been a routine corporate celebration into a memorable event that would be discussed throughout the industry for months. Several people approached to express personal support, sharing their own experiences with hidden identities, or with the challenges of being underestimated based on others' assumptions. These connections were unexpected and welcome, suggesting that my revelation might create opportunities for more authentic relationships with colleagues who had previously known me only as peripheral spouse rather than central leader. By 11 o'clock, the ballroom had largely emptied except for Catherine Morrison, Robert Chun, 2 board members and myself. We moved to a smaller conference room within the hotel to discuss immediate next steps regarding public communications about the ownership revelation. The conversation was pragmatic and focused, addressing questions about media strategy, internal company announcements, and stakeholder management that would be necessary to control the narrative about my emergence from anonymity. The planning continued until nearly midnight, by which point we had established a comprehensive communication strategy that would position the revelation as a positive development, reflecting my commitment to leadership transparency, rather than as scandal or crisis requiring damage control. The approach was designed to protect both the company's reputation and my own privacy to the extent still possible after such public exposure, while also acknowledging the unusual circumstances that had led to the dramatic reveal at Daniel's promotion party. When I finally left the hotel and walked to my car in the parking structure, the night air felt clearer and easier to breathe than it had in years. The weight of maintained secrecy had been lifted, replaced by uncertainty about what would come next, but also by a sense of possibility that had been absent when I was trapped within the limiting role I had constructed for myself. Whatever challenges awaited in my marriage, my public life, and my acknowledged leadership of Meridian Global Industries, I would face them as my complete self rather than as the diminished character I had been performing for far too long. The drive home from the Peninsula Hotel took 40 minutes through late-night Manhattan traffic, providing ample time for reflection on the evening's events and contemplation of what awaited when I arrived at the penthouse apartment Daniel and I had shared for the past 4 years. The residence was located in a building overlooking Central Park, a property I had purchased through one of my holding companies shortly after our wedding. Daniel believed we were renting the space at what he considered a stretch of our combined budget, another small deception among the many I had maintained to preserve my anonymous existence within our marriage. I had not expected Daniel to be home when I arrived, assuming he would need considerably more time to process the revelation before feeling prepared to face direct conversation. However, as I entered the apartment at nearly 1 a.m, I found him sitting in the living room with lights dimmed and a glass of whiskey in his hand. His suit jacket had been discarded and his tie loosened, but he remained otherwise dressed in his formal attire from the promotion celebration. The posture suggested he had been sitting there for some time, drinking and thinking in the darkness of our shared space that had suddenly become foreign territory for both of us. He looked up when I entered but did not speak immediately. I moved into the living room and sat in the chair across from the sofa where he was positioned, maintaining physical distance that reflected the emotional chasm that had opened between us over the course of the evening. The silence extended for nearly a minute before Daniel finally gathered himself to speak, his voice rougher than usual from a combination of alcohol consumption and emotional strain. He began by asking how long I had been planning the revelation, whether the timing at his promotion party had been deliberately calculated to cause maximum humiliation. The question revealed his interpretation of events, his assumption that my disclosure had been motivated primarily by desire to punish or embarrass him, rather than by accumulated frustration with being consistently underestimated and dismissed. The self-centered reading of the situation was characteristic of the patterns that had developed in our relationship over the past several years. His default assumption that my actions revolved around him rather than emerging from my own needs and experiences. I explained that the timing had indeed been deliberate, but not in the way he imagined. I told him that 3 months earlier I had begun documenting instances where he diminished my intelligence or dismissed my contributions, initially without clear intention about how that documentation might be used. The evidence gathering had been prompted by the dinner party incident where he had laughed off my suggestion about the European logistics problem, treating my insight as naive misunderstanding rather than as the informed perspective it actually was. That moment had crystallized something I had been noticing with increasing frequency, a pattern of casual disrespect that had become so normalized in our interactions that I had almost stopped recognizing it as problematic. The documentation project had revealed the extent of the problem far more comprehensively than I had anticipated when I began. Over the course of 3 months, I had accumulated more than 40 distinct instances where Daniel had explained basic business concepts to me that I had mastered years earlier, where he had dismissed my observations as uninformed opinions, or where he had described me to others as someone who did not understand the complexities of his professional world. The pattern was consistent and pervasive, embedded so deeply in how he perceived me that he engaged in these behaviors without apparent awareness or malice. The casual nature of the disrespect made it somehow worse than if it had been intentional cruelty, because it meant he genuinely believed the diminished version of me he had constructed in his mind. Daniel listened to this explanation with visible discomfort, shifting his position on the sofa and refilling his whiskey glass before responding. He argued that I was interpreting normal conversational patterns as disrespect, that his explanations had been offered in good faith as helpful information sharing rather than as patronizing lectures. He suggested that my sensitivity to these interactions might be excessive, that I was reading negative intent into behaviors that had been motivated by desire to include me in his professional world, rather than to exclude or diminish me. The response was so predictable, and so characteristic of our established dynamic, that I almost felt a sense of weary recognition rather than fresh anger. Even confronted with direct feedback about patterns I had carefully documented over months, his instinctive reaction was to suggest that the problem lay in my perception rather than in his behavior. The deflection was automatic, so ingrained in how he responded to criticism that he apparently could not recognize it as defensive maneuver rather than legitimate analysis. I retrieved my phone and opened the documentation file I had been maintaining, a detailed spreadsheet tracking dates, contexts, specific quotes, and witnesses for each incident I had recorded. The organizational system was sophisticated and thorough, reflecting both my analytical nature and my recognition that any eventual confrontation would require irrefutable evidence rather than general impressions or feelings. I had learned long ago that claiming to be hurt or disrespected was far less effective than demonstrating patterns through systematic documentation that could not be easily dismissed as misunderstanding or oversensitivity. I walked Daniel through several entries in the spreadsheet, reading his exact words back to him and providing context about why those statements had been problematic, given what he now knew about my actual expertise and role within Meridian Global Industries. One entry documented a conversation where he had explained to me what a profit margin was, speaking slowly and using simplified language as though describing advanced mathematics to a child. Another captured his description to a colleague of how I tried to understand his work, but lacked the educational background to grasp sophisticated business strategy. A third included his dismissal of my suggestion about supply chain optimization during a dinner party, followed by his implementation of essentially the same approach 3 weeks later after hearing it proposed by a consultant he respected. Each example I shared seemed to land with cumulative weight, Daniel's expression growing progressively more strained as he recognized his own words and behaviors presented back to him in aggregate form that made the pattern undeniable. When viewed individually, each incident might have been defensible as misunderstanding or innocent comment. Presented collectively as systematic evidence of sustained disrespect, the behavior became impossible to rationalize as anything other than what it was: fundamental failure to recognize or value my actual capabilities because they did not align with his preconceived assumptions about what someone in my supposed position should know or be able to contribute. After I had shared approximately a dozen entries from the spreadsheet, Daniel requested that I stop, holding up his hand in a gesture of surrender or perhaps of being overwhelmed by information he was not prepared to process. He acknowledged that looking at the patterns I had documented, he could see how his behavior might have been experienced as dismissive or disrespectful. The concession was qualified and tentative, acknowledging possibility rather than certainty, but it represented more self-awareness than he had demonstrated at any point during our marriage when confronted with concerns about how he treated me. He then shifted to asking why I had not simply told him the truth about my identity years earlier, why I had allowed the deception to continue when it was apparently causing such significant problems in how we related to each other. The question revealed continued focus on my choices rather than on his behaviors, his apparent belief that the primary problem was my dishonesty rather than his consistent failure to recognize value in someone he perceived as less professionally accomplished than himself. I explained that the test I had designed when we first met had been intended to determine whether someone could love and respect me independent of my wealth and position, whether authentic partnership was possible when one person did not know about resources and power the other possessed. What I had discovered over 7 years was something more troubling than whether Daniel could love me without knowing about my money. I had learned that he could not respect me without visible markers of authority and accomplishment, that his capacity to value another person appeared fundamentally dependent on their recognized status, rather than on their intrinsic qualities or demonstrated capabilities. This observation struck Daniel with particular force, perhaps because it required him to confront something about his own character rather than simply about our relationship dynamics. He sat silently for an extended period, apparently considering implications that reached beyond our immediate situation to touch on questions about what he actually valued in people, and whether those values reflected the person he wanted to be. The introspection was uncomfortable to witness but also necessary if any productive conversation about our future was to be possible. Eventually Daniel asked what I wanted from him now, whether I intended to divorce him, or whether some path forward existed that could preserve our marriage despite the revelations of the evening. The question was direct and practical, seeking clarity about immediate future, rather than continuing to process the emotional and psychological implications of what had been revealed. The shift toward practical concerns was characteristic of how he managed difficult situations, moving quickly from feeling toward action planning as a way of regaining sense of control when circumstances felt overwhelming. I responded honestly that I did not yet know what I wanted, that the decision about our marriage would require time and reflection that I could not compress into a single evening of conversation regardless of how dramatic the circumstances. I noted that learning my true identity was only one aspect of what Daniel needed to process. More fundamentally, he needed to examine the patterns of behavior that had made my concealment feel necessary, and to determine whether he was capable of relating to a partner as an equal rather than as someone whose value derived from their service to his ambitions and ego. The conversation continued for another 2 hours, cycling through various aspects of our relationship history, and examining moments that now appeared in entirely different light, given the revealed information about my actual identity and position. Daniel asked whether specific incidents had been tests or manipulations, whether I had been constantly evaluating him throughout our marriage rather than simply participating authentically in our shared life. I explained that while I had been observing his behavior with particular attention, I had also been genuinely engaged in building what I hoped would become a meaningful partnership based on mutual respect and authentic connection. The distinction between observation and manipulation seemed important to establish. The difference between documenting what was naturally occurring versus deliberately creating situations designed to produce specific responses. I had never engineered scenarios to test Daniel's character. I had simply paid careful attention to how he behaved in organic circumstances, noting patterns that emerged from his own choices and instincts rather than from situations I had artificially constructed to evaluate his responses. As the night progressed toward early morning, exhaustion began affecting both of our capacities for productive conversation. Daniel suggested that we should attempt to sleep and resume discussion after we had both rested and processed the evening's revelations with clearer minds. I agreed to the postponement, recognizing that continued conversation in our current state would likely produce more confusion than clarity. We retired to separate bedrooms, Daniel to our usual shared space and I to the guest room that had functioned primarily as storage for items we did not regularly use. The physical separation felt appropriate given the emotional distance that had opened between us, creating literal space that reflected the psychological gap we would need to navigate if any reconciliation was to be possible. As I prepared for sleep in the unfamiliar room, I reflected on the strange journey that had led from the morning's anticipation of Daniel's promotion celebration to the current situation where our marriage hung in uncertain balance and my carefully guarded anonymity had been permanently destroyed. The following morning arrived too quickly, sunlight streaming through unfamiliar windows to wake me after only 4 hours of restless sleep. I emerged from the guest room to find Daniel already awake and dressed in casual clothes rather than his usual business attire. He informed me that he had called in to take a personal day from work, recognizing that attempting to face colleagues and supervisors immediately after the previous evening's revelations would be impossible to manage effectively. The decision showed reasonable judgment about his own limitations and about the magnitude of adjustment required before he could return to normal professional functioning. We prepared breakfast together in silence that was more comfortable than the tense conversations of the previous night, falling into familiar routines of coffee preparation and meal assembly that provided structure when direct interaction felt too difficult. Once we were seated at the dining table, Daniel initiated conversation by acknowledging that he had spent much of the night reviewing his memories of our relationship through the lens of what he now knew about my true identity and capabilities. He said that he could identify numerous instances where I had offered insights or perspectives that should have revealed sophisticated understanding of business operations, but that he had systematically dismissed or overlooked because they did not fit his assumptions about what I should know. The acknowledgement was significant, representing movement from defensive justification toward genuine recognition of patterns he had participated in creating and maintaining. I appreciated the willingness to examine his own behavior with critical lens rather than continuing to deflect responsibility onto my deception or my supposedly excessive sensitivity to ordinary interactions. Daniel then asked whether I would be willing to share more about my actual role at Meridian Global Industries, expressing curiosity about what my days actually looked like compared to the event planning activities I had described to him over the years. The request suggested genuine interest rather than simply strategic information gathering, a desire to understand the reality of my life, rather than to manage his response to revelations that affected his own position and reputation. I described my typical work patterns, explaining how I managed board responsibilities, strategic planning sessions, and operational oversight through a combination of remote participation and occasional in-person meetings scheduled during hours when Daniel believed I was meeting with nonprofit clients. I detailed some of the major decisions I had been involved in over the past 5 years, including the acquisition of 2 smaller manufacturing firms, the expansion into Southeast Asian markets, and the implementation of comprehensive sustainability initiatives that had reduced Meridian's environmental impact, while also improving operational efficiency and cost structure. As I shared this information, I watched Daniel's expression shift through various reactions, including surprise at the scope of my involvement, respect for the sophistication of the work I had been managing, and what appeared to be renewed embarrassment about how thoroughly he had misunderstood the person he had been married to for 7 years. The emotional journey playing across his features was complex and genuine, suggesting that he was beginning to grasp not just the factual reality of my position, but also the implications for how he had perceived and treated me throughout our relationship. The morning conversation eventually turned toward practical questions about how we should proceed in the immediate term. Daniel asked whether I intended to make any changes to living arrangements, or whether I expected him to move out of the apartment. I explained that the residence was actually owned by one of my holding companies rather than rented as he had believed, another small deception in the fabric of larger concealment. I told him that he was welcome to remain in the apartment while we determined whether our marriage could be salvaged or whether divorce was the appropriate resolution. The revelation that I owned our home produced another visible reaction, Daniel apparently realizing that virtually every aspect of our shared life had been structured around resources I provided while he remained unaware of their true source. He asked directly how much of our lifestyle had been funded by my wealth rather than by his income, whether he had been contributing meaningfully to our household or simply benefiting from resources he did not know existed. I explained that I had been careful to maintain balance in our financial arrangements, that I had limited my contributions to levels that could plausibly come from successful event planning work so that Daniel's salary and bonuses would genuinely cover a substantial portion of our expenses. However, I acknowledged that the apartment itself and various other aspects of our lifestyle exceeded what would have been possible on his income alone, that I had quietly supplemented our resources when necessary to maintain the comfort level we both enjoyed. The conversation about finances continued for some time, Daniel asking detailed questions about specific purchases and expenses, apparently trying to map out which aspects of our life together had been authentic shared experience versus which had been enabled by wealth he had not known I possessed. The accounting exercise seemed important for his sense of understanding reality, creating a comprehensive picture of how thoroughly my concealment had pervaded every dimension of our marriage. By early afternoon, we had exhausted immediate topics and fallen into thoughtful silence. Daniel eventually stated that he needed time to process everything we had discussed, that he could not immediately determine how he felt about our relationship, or whether he was capable of the kind of fundamental change in perspective that would be necessary for us to move forward successfully. I agreed that time was appropriate and necessary, that decisions of this magnitude could not be rushed regardless of how dramatic the precipitating circumstances had been. We established basic parameters for the coming days and weeks. We would continue sharing the apartment but maintain separate sleeping arrangements. We would both take time to reflect individually on whether the marriage was worth preserving, and what changes would be required from each of us if we decided to attempt reconciliation. We would schedule periodic conversations to share our evolving thoughts, but would not pressure each other for premature decisions or commitments. The framework provided structure for navigating uncertain period ahead, while also creating space for the genuine introspection and emotional processing that would be necessary before either of us could make informed choices about our future. As we concluded our discussion and Daniel retreated to his office to spend time alone with his thoughts, I recognized that the revelation at the promotion party had been only the beginning of a much longer journey toward either reconciliation or separation, toward either transformed relationship based on authentic recognition of who we both were or toward acknowledgement that too much damage had been done for genuine partnership to be possible. The following week unfolded with a peculiar mixture of routine and disruption, as the revelation from the promotion party rippled through both my personal life and the broader professional landscape of Meridian Global Industries. The news had spread rapidly through industry networks, amplified by social media posts from attendees at the event, and by business journalists who recognized the human interest angle of a story involving secret corporate ownership, marital deception, and dramatic public revelation. By Monday morning, my emergence from anonymity had been covered in 3 major business publications and had become a trending topic in several professional networking forums where corporate governance and leadership dynamics were regularly discussed. Catherine Morrison called early that morning to brief me on media requests that had already begun arriving at Meridian's communications department. Reporters wanted interviews about my background, my leadership philosophy, my reasons for maintaining anonymity, and my perspective on being a woman leading a major industrial conglomerate while remaining publicly invisible. The volume of interest exceeded what we had anticipated during our late-night planning session at the Peninsula Hotel, suggesting that the story had resonated beyond typical business news audiences to reach broader public attention. Catherine recommended that we arrange a single comprehensive interview with a respected business journalist, rather than attempting to respond to dozens of individual media requests. She suggested that providing one authoritative account of my story would allow us to control the narrative more effectively than trying to manage multiple conversations across different outlets with varying editorial standards and perspectives. I agreed with her strategic assessment and asked her to identify appropriate journalists who had demonstrated both fairness in their reporting and sophistication in understanding complex corporate governance issues. Beyond the media attention, Catherine also needed to discuss more immediate operational matters relating to my revealed identity. The board of directors had scheduled an emergency meeting for later in the week to address questions about how my public emergence would affect governance structures, communication protocols, and stakeholder relationships. Several board members who had been unaware of my true identity were understandably concerned about having participated in oversight of a company where the ultimate authority had been concealed from them. While my anonymity had been legally proper and had not violated any fiduciary duties or regulatory requirements, the revelation created discomfort for directors who felt they should have been informed about ownership realities, regardless of legal technicalities. Catherine also mentioned that Daniel had not appeared at work on Monday, having extended his personal day through the remainder of the week. Robert Chun had approved the leave request without requiring detailed explanation, recognizing that Daniel needed time to process both the personal and professional implications of what had been revealed at the promotion party. However, Catherine noted that Daniel's absence was creating practical difficulties for his division, where several time-sensitive projects required senior leadership attention that was not currently available. The situation underscored one of many complications that would need to be addressed as both Daniel and I navigated our changed circumstances. I spent Monday morning working from the apartment rather than attempting to visit Meridian's offices, recognizing that my physical presence would create distraction and disruption at a moment when the company needed to maintain operational focus despite the dramatic personal revelations about ownership and leadership. I participated in several video conferences with division heads who were managing various strategic initiatives, finding that the revealed context of my identity actually made these conversations more productive than previous interactions where I had needed to maintain the fiction of remote participation from undisclosed locations. The ease of these professional conversations stood in sharp contrast to the difficulty of my personal situation. Daniel and I had been maintaining careful distance within the apartment, our interactions limited to brief exchanges about practical household matters while we each spent extended time processing individually. I had observed him working at his laptop during hours that suggested he was researching topics related to our situation, perhaps reading articles about the revelation or exploring information about corporate ownership structures and family wealth that he had never previously had reason to investigate. On Tuesday afternoon, Daniel's mother Margaret called my phone, her tone combining concern and barely concealed anger as she demanded to know what I had done to her son and why I had humiliated him so publicly at what should have been a celebration of his professional achievement. The conversation was difficult and ultimately unproductive, as Margaret appeared unable or unwilling to consider perspectives beyond Daniel's wounded pride and damaged reputation. She characterized my years of concealment as cruel manipulation and suggested that I owed Daniel both an apology and substantial financial compensation for the emotional harm I had caused through my deception. I attempted to explain the context that had led to my decision to maintain anonymity, describing my concerns about being valued for wealth rather than character and my desire to build a relationship based on authentic connection. Margaret dismissed these explanations as self-serving justifications, arguing that no legitimate reason could excuse deceiving a spouse about such fundamental matters as identity and resources. The conversation concluded without resolution, Margaret demanding that I make things right for her son, while I maintained that addressing our situation would require acknowledgement of problems beyond my concealment, including patterns of disrespect and dismissiveness that had characterized how Daniel treated me throughout our marriage. After ending the call with Margaret, I recognized that family dynamics would add additional complexity to whatever path Daniel and I ultimately chose regarding our marriage. His mother had always been protective of him to a degree that sometimes prevented him from fully confronting consequences of his choices and behaviors. Her interpretation of current circumstances as primarily my fault for deceiving him rather than as a complex situation involving failures from both of us suggested that family pressure would consistently push Daniel toward positions that absolved him of responsibility for examining his own contributions to our marital difficulties. Wednesday brought the scheduled board meeting where my revealed identity would be formally addressed through corporate governance channels. I prepared thoroughly for the conversation, anticipating questions about why I had maintained anonymity from the board itself, and about what my emergence meant for future governance practices and transparency expectations. Catherine had briefed me on concerns that various directors had expressed privately, allowing me to develop responses that would address their legitimate governance questions, while also maintaining appropriate boundaries around personal matters that were not properly within the board's purview. The meeting convened at 2 p.m. via secure video conference, with all 12 board members participating along with Catherine Morrison and the company's general counsel. I joined from my apartment rather than from Meridian's offices, maintaining the physical separation that seemed prudent while media attention remained elevated. The video format also provided slight psychological distance that made the necessarily difficult conversation somewhat easier to manage than face-to-face interaction might have been. The board chair, Thomas Wellington, opened the discussion by acknowledging the unusual circumstances and noting that while my anonymity had been legally permissible, the revelation had created questions that deserved thoughtful examination. He invited me to provide context about my decision to maintain concealment, and about how I envisioned my role evolving now that my identity was public knowledge. I delivered remarks that I had carefully prepared, explaining my reasons for anonymity in terms that focused on my desire to evaluate management and board performance without the complications that would have arisen from known ownership presence. I noted that my father had operated Meridian with a highly visible leadership style that had sometimes created challenges for executives who felt unable to make independent decisions without constant reference to ownership preferences. When I inherited controlling interest, I had deliberately chosen a different approach that would allow professional management to operate with genuine autonomy, while I maintained strategic oversight through board participation and periodic reviews of major decisions. The explanation was truthful and also strategic, framing my anonymity in terms of governance philosophy, rather than personal concerns about relationships and authentic connection. The board did not need to know about my marital situation or my concerns about being valued for wealth rather than character. What they needed was assurance that my concealment had served legitimate business purposes, and that my revealed identity would not fundamentally disrupt governance practices or operational effectiveness. Several board members asked probing questions about specific instances where my anonymous status might have affected their decision-making, or where earlier disclosure might have changed outcomes on particular strategic matters. I addressed each inquiry directly, acknowledging that anonymity had indeed shaped certain dynamics while also demonstrating that major decisions had been made based on sound business judgment, rather than on information deficits created by my concealment. The discussion was thorough and sometimes uncomfortable, but ultimately productive in establishing that while my approach had been unconventional, it had not compromised the board's capacity to fulfill its fiduciary responsibilities. Thomas Wellington eventually guided the conversation toward forward-looking questions about governance structures going forward. Several directors advocated for my taking a more visible role in company leadership, potentially assuming an official title such as board chair, or even co-chief executive alongside Catherine Morrison. Others expressed concern that too much change too quickly might create instability, suggesting that maintaining current structures while simply acknowledging my ownership publicly might be the more prudent approach. I responded by indicating that I was open to considering various governance arrangements, but that immediate dramatic changes seemed inadvisable, while media attention remained intense, and while both internal stakeholders and external partners were still adjusting to the revealed information about ownership. I suggested that we establish a governance committee to examine options over the next several months, allowing time for thoughtful analysis, rather than making reactive decisions driven by current circumstances and pressures. The board accepted this recommendation, approving formation of a special committee that would report back with governance recommendations at the next quarterly meeting. The solution provided structure for addressing legitimate questions, while also creating space for the organization to stabilize before implementing potentially significant changes to leadership arrangements and reporting relationships. As the board meeting concluded, I felt a sense of accomplishment about having navigated a difficult conversation more successfully than I had feared might be possible. The directors had asked hard questions, but had ultimately demonstrated willingness to focus on substantive governance matters, rather than on personal drama or judgment about my choices regarding anonymity. The professional separation between corporate oversight and personal circumstances had been maintained, establishing a productive boundary that would serve everyone well as we moved forward. Thursday brought the scheduled interview with Jennifer Chan, a senior business journalist whose work I had followed and respected for years. Catherine had arranged for Jennifer to come to the apartment for a 2-hour conversation that would provide material for a comprehensive profile piece examining my background, my approach to corporate leadership, and my emergence from anonymity. I had reviewed Jennifer's previous articles carefully, noting her tendency toward balanced reporting that examined complexity, rather than reducing stories to simple narratives of heroes and villains. Jennifer arrived promptly at 10 in the morning, her demeanor professional and respectful as we settled into the living room for our conversation. She began with straightforward biographical questions about my family background, my education, and my path to inheriting Meridian Global Industries from my father. I provided information that was factual, while also maintaining appropriate privacy about personal matters that were not relevant to the professional story she was developing. The conversation progressed to more complex territory as Jennifer asked about my decision to maintain anonymity, and about the personal circumstances that had influenced that choice. I explained my concerns about being valued for wealth rather than character, describing how previous relationship experiences had led me to question whether authentic connection was possible when such significant power and resource imbalances were known from the beginning. Jennifer listened carefully and asked thoughtful follow-up questions that demonstrated her understanding of the psychological complexity involved in navigating substantial inherited wealth, while also seeking genuine personal relationships. Eventually, the discussion reached the inevitable questions about Daniel and about the promotion party revelation. Jennifer approached these topics with sensitivity, acknowledging that the marital dimensions of my story involved privacy considerations that might limit what I was comfortable discussing publicly. I appreciated her recognition of boundaries and provided information that focused on professional rather than intimate aspects of the situation. I explained that my husband had not known about my ownership of Meridian, that this concealment had served my desire to be known for myself rather than for my position, and that the revelation at his promotion party had emerged from accumulated frustration with being consistently underestimated and dismissed despite possessing significant expertise and capability. Jennifer asked directly whether my marriage was likely to survive the revelations and their aftermath. I responded honestly that the outcome remained uncertain, that Daniel and I were both engaged in serious reflection about whether reconciliation was possible, or whether the patterns that had developed in our relationship had caused damage beyond repair. I noted that while my concealment had certainly contributed to our difficulties, the more fundamental problem had been persistent failure to recognize and respect capabilities that should have been apparent regardless of what he knew about my corporate position or financial resources. The interview continued for the full 2 hours, ranging across topics including my vision for Meridian's future direction, my perspectives on women's leadership in traditionally male-dominated industries, and my thoughts about how inherited wealth created both opportunities and obligations for those fortunate enough to possess it. Throughout the conversation, I was struck by how much easier it felt to discuss these matters openly rather than maintaining the careful concealment that had characterized my life for the past 7 years. The relief of living without constant monitoring and management of information was profound, suggesting that whatever challenges accompanied my revealed identity, The freedom from sustained deception represented meaningful improvement in quality of life. After Jennifer departed, I spent the afternoon reviewing materials that Rebecca had compiled regarding the media coverage of my emergence from anonymity. The articles ranged from straightforward business reporting, focused on governance implications, to more sensationalized pieces, emphasizing the dramatic aspects of the promotion party revelation. Several commentators had offered perspectives on my choices and their ethics, with opinions divided between those who viewed my concealment as reasonable given legitimate concerns about authentic relationships, and those who characterized it as deceptive manipulation that had unfairly disadvantaged Daniel. The range of public reaction reinforced my recognition that there were no clear answers about whether I had handled the situation appropriately, or whether different choices might have produced better outcomes. What remained clear was that I had been operating from genuine concerns about being valued authentically, that I had not anticipated how difficult it would be to maintain dual identity over extended time, and that the revelation had ultimately been necessary regardless of its dramatic circumstances because continuing to live with such fundamental concealment had become unsustainable. Friday arrived with unexpected news from Catherine Morrison. Daniel had contacted Robert Chun to request a meeting for the following Monday to discuss his future with Meridian Global Industries. The request suggested that Daniel was contemplating significant changes to his professional circumstances, potentially including resignation from his position or request for transfer to different division or location, where he would not be working under supervision of people who now knew that his wife owned the company. Catherine asked whether I had any guidance about how Robert should approach the conversation, or whether I wanted to be consulted before any decisions were made regarding Daniel's employment status. I responded that Daniel's career should be managed based solely on his professional performance and on what made sense for Meridian's operational needs. I emphasized that my personal relationship with him should not influence employment decisions in either direction, neither protecting him from consequences if his performance declined nor pushing him out simply because our marital situation had become complicated and publicly known. Catherine acknowledged the guidance and assured me that Robert would handle the situation with appropriate professionalism and focus on legitimate business considerations. As the week drew to a close, I found myself reflecting on how dramatically my circumstances had transformed in just 7 days. I had moved from carefully guarded anonymity to public visibility, from pretending to know little about business to openly exercising authority over a major corporation, from uncertain marriage to separation and contemplation of divorce. The changes were disorienting and sometimes overwhelming, but they also carried a sense of alignment and authenticity that had been missing throughout the years when I lived divided between my true self and the limited persona I presented to my husband and to the world he inhabited. Whatever difficulties lay ahead, I would face them as complete person rather than as carefully edited version designed to test whether I could be loved without the complications that accompanied my actual identity and position. The weekend following the tumultuous week brought an unexpected quiet to the apartment. Daniel had left Friday evening to stay with his mother in Connecticut, explaining briefly that he needed distance and perspective that could not be achieved while we continued sharing the same living space. I had not objected to his departure, recognizing that our careful coexistence had been draining emotional energy from both of us without producing the clarity or insight that genuine separation might provide. His absence transformed the apartment from a space of tense negotiation into something closer to sanctuary, allowing me to experience my own thoughts and feelings without the constant awareness of his presence and his processing of the revelations that had upended both our lives. Saturday morning arrived with brilliant sunshine that seemed almost inappropriately cheerful given the gravity of my circumstances. I made coffee in the quiet kitchen and carried it to the windows overlooking Central Park, watching early joggers and dog walkers navigate the paths below while I contemplated the trajectory that had led from my father's death 5 years earlier to this moment of fractured marriage and public exposure. The journey had been marked by choices that seemed reasonable at each decision point, but had accumulated into a situation whose complexity I had not fully anticipated when I first decided to conceal my identity from the man I was dating. I spent much of Saturday engaged in the kind of deep reflection that had been impossible during the chaotic week following the promotion party revelation. Without the immediate pressures of media inquiries, board meetings, and careful navigation of shared space with Daniel, I could finally examine my own motivations and choices with the honesty that effective self-assessment required. The process was uncomfortable in ways that forced confrontation with aspects of my behavior and reasoning that I had previously justified without sufficient critical examination. The concealment of my identity from Daniel had been motivated by legitimate concerns about being valued for wealth rather than character, concerns rooted in genuine experiences from previous relationships where my family's resources had clearly been more attractive than my actual personality or capabilities. However, as I reflected more carefully on how I had implemented this protective strategy, I recognized that it had also served less admirable purposes. Maintaining anonymity had allowed me to avoid the vulnerability that came with being fully known, had provided convenient excuse for not addressing problems in our relationship directly, and had enabled a certain detachment where I could observe Daniel's behavior as though conducting an experiment rather than fully participating in the messy reality of intimate partnership. This recognition did not absolve Daniel of responsibility for the patterns of dismissiveness and disrespect that had characterized his treatment of me throughout our marriage. His behaviors had been real and problematic regardless of what information he possessed about my background and position. However, my concealment had created conditions that made those behaviors more likely to emerge and persist, had prevented the kind of honest communication that might have addressed problems before they became entrenched patterns, and had ultimately transformed our relationship into something fundamentally dishonest regardless of how much genuine affection existed alongside the deception. I found myself thinking about my father and about conversations we had during the final months of his life when he knew that control of Meridian would soon pass to me. He had spoken extensively about the responsibilities and burdens that accompanied inherited wealth and power, emphasizing that these resources created obligations rather than simply providing advantages. One conversation in particular returned to my memory with new significance as I reflected on my current situation. He had warned me about the temptation to use wealth and power as shields against genuine human connection, noting that the capacity to control circumstances and manage information flow could become a trap that prevented authentic relationships from developing. At the time, I had understood his warning primarily in terms of avoiding romantic partners who were attracted to my resources rather than to myself. What I had failed to fully grasp was his deeper concern about how possessing such significant advantages might change me, might encourage a kind of strategic approach to relationships where I maintained excessive control and failed to take the risks that genuine intimacy required. Looking back across 7 years of marriage to Daniel, I could see how my concealment strategy had reflected exactly the pattern my father had cautioned against, using information control as a way to manage risk rather than accepting the vulnerability that came with being fully known and potentially rejected or exploited. This self-examination led to painful acknowledgement that while Daniel had certainly failed to recognize and respect my capabilities, I had also failed to trust him with truth about my identity and position. The failure was not equivalent or symmetrical, as his dismissive behaviors reflected character issues that extended beyond our specific situation, while my concealment had been targeted response to particular concerns. Nevertheless, both of us had contributed to creating a relationship built on unstable foundations where authentic partnership could not develop, because neither of us was being fully honest about who we were and what we needed from each other. Sunday brought an unexpected visitor when Rebecca appeared at my door carrying files and her laptop, explaining that she had been thinking about my situation and wanted to offer both professional assistance and personal support. We settled into the living room with fresh coffee, and she asked directly how I was managing the emotional dimensions of the past week's events. Her question was simple but profound, cutting through the strategic and practical matters that had dominated my attention to address the human cost of revelation and marital crisis that I had been largely avoiding in favor of managing external reactions and corporate implications. I found myself responding with more emotional honesty than I had permitted myself throughout the week. I described feeling simultaneously relieved and disoriented by the end of concealment, grateful for the freedom of living openly, while also mourning the loss of the protective privacy that anonymity had provided. I acknowledged uncertainty about my marriage and confusion about my own desires regarding whether reconciliation with Daniel was something I genuinely wanted, or simply felt obligated to pursue because of the years we had invested in our relationship. I expressed guilt about the dramatic nature of the revelation and about the public humiliation Daniel had experienced, even while recognizing that his humiliation stemmed primarily from his own behaviors and attitudes being exposed rather than from anything I had done to him maliciously. Rebecca listened without judgment or premature reassurance, creating space for me to articulate feelings that I had not previously allowed myself to fully acknowledge. When I finished speaking, she offered observations drawn from her years of close collaboration and the unique perspective she had gained from managing the practical details of my double life. She noted that she had watched me become progressively smaller and more constrained over the course of my marriage, that the woman she had worked with during the early months after my father's death had possessed a confidence and ease that had gradually diminished as I adapted to the limiting role I played in Daniel's presence. Her assessment was difficult to hear precisely because it rang true in ways I had not wanted to acknowledge. I had attributed changes in my demeanor and presentation to natural adjustment to marriage and to the practical demands of maintaining dual identity, without recognizing that something more troubling was occurring. I had been adapting not just my public presentation but my actual sense of self, allowing Daniel's limited perception of my capabilities to gradually erode my own confidence in my judgment and expertise. The erosion had been subtle enough that I had not registered it as it happened, but looking back across 7 years I could see the trajectory clearly. Rebecca suggested that perhaps the revelation and its aftermath, painful as they were, might ultimately serve a valuable purpose by forcing me to reclaim aspects of myself that I had surrendered or suppressed. She noted that the past week had shown glimpses of a more forthright and confident version of myself, someone who could navigate difficult board conversations and media interviews with clarity and strength that had sometimes been absent in recent years. Her observation helped me recognize that while the current situation involved loss and uncertainty, it also offered opportunity for reconstruction and growth that might not have been possible within the constraints of my concealed existence. Our conversation shifted to more practical matters as Rebecca briefed me on various operational issues requiring attention at Meridian and on developments in the media coverage of my emergence from anonymity. The Jennifer Chen profile piece was scheduled to publish on Tuesday and would likely generate renewed attention and discussion. Several other journalists had submitted requests for follow-up interviews or for access to different aspects of my story, requests that would need to be evaluated and managed strategically to maintain appropriate boundaries while also satisfying legitimate public interest in an unusual and compelling narrative. Rebecca also mentioned that she had been approached by a literary agent who expressed interest in representing me if I wanted to write a memoir about my experiences navigating inherited wealth, maintaining anonymity, and leading a major corporation while being publicly invisible. The proposal was premature given current circumstances, but Rebecca suggested keeping the option in mind for potential future consideration if I eventually wanted to share my story in a more comprehensive and controlled format than journalism could provide. After Rebecca departed in the early afternoon, I spent time reviewing correspondence that had accumulated over the past week from various professional contacts, former classmates, and acquaintances who had learned about my revealed identity through media coverage or social network discussions. The messages ranged from expressions of support and admiration to requests for meetings or advice to transparent attempts at establishing connections that might provide access to resources or opportunities. Sorting through these communications required judgment about which relationships were worth investing in, and which represented exactly the kind of opportunistic interest that had motivated my anonymity in the first place. One message in particular caught my attention, coming from a woman named Sarah Mitchell who I had known briefly during graduate school, but had lost contact with over subsequent years. Sarah wrote that she had followed my story with particular interest because she was navigating similar challenges in her own life, having recently inherited a family business that she was attempting to lead while managing complicated dynamics with a spouse who had not known about the extent of her family's wealth. She expressed appreciation for seeing someone else grapple publicly with questions about authentic relationships and about the challenges of being valued for capabilities rather than for resources, noting that these struggles often felt isolating because they were difficult to discuss with people who had not experienced similar circumstances. I responded to Sarah's message with more personal detail than I included in most of my correspondence, acknowledging the isolation she described and expressing my own surprise at discovering how many people had reached out with similar experiences after my story became public. I suggested that we schedule a conversation in coming weeks when my immediate situation had stabilized somewhat, recognizing potential value in connecting with someone who could understand the specific complexities of navigating inherited wealth and power within intimate relationships. The weekend concluded with a phone call from Daniel on Sunday evening. His voice sounded strained but calmer than during our previous conversations, suggesting that the time with his mother and the physical distance from our shared apartment had provided some of the perspective he needed. He explained that he had spent the weekend thinking extensively about our relationship and about his own behaviors and attitudes, acknowledging that he could now see patterns that he had previously been blind to or had rationalized as normal rather than problematic. Daniel stated that he recognized having consistently underestimated me, and having treated my perspectives as less valuable than they deserved to be treated, based on their actual merit. He acknowledged that this dismissiveness had stemmed partly from his own insecurities about his professional achievements, and from his need to position himself as the competent authority within our relationship. He noted that learning I had been funding aspects of our lifestyle and had been managing a company far more successfully than he had been managing his division at that same company had forced confrontation with uncomfortable truths about his own limitations and about the ego-driven nature of how he had constructed his self-image. The self-awareness demonstrated in these admissions was more substantial than I had expected, based on our previous conversations. I listened carefully as he continued, noting both the genuine recognition of problems and the underlying focus that remained centered on his own experience and processing rather than on understanding impact on me or on considering what I might need from him if reconciliation was to be possible. This persistent self-focus was not malicious but seemed almost reflexive, the default orientation of someone who had spent his life being the primary character in his own narrative, without developing capacity to fully inhabit the perspectives of others. Daniel asked whether I would be willing to engage in couples counseling, suggesting that professional guidance might help us navigate the complex emotional territory we needed to address if we were to determine whether our marriage could be salvaged. I agreed to the proposal, recognizing that structured therapeutic conversation might provide the framework and accountability that our own discussions seemed unable to generate. We arranged to research potential therapists during the coming week, and to schedule initial sessions as soon as possible given the urgency of our situation and the limitations of continuing in our current state of uncertain separation. After ending the call with Daniel, I felt cautiously hopeful about the possibility of productive engagement with our relationship problems, while also maintaining realistic awareness that insight and good intentions often proved insufficient when attempting to address deeply entrenched patterns. The work ahead would require sustained effort and genuine change from both of us, and the outcome remained uncertain regardless of how much we might want to preserve something from 7 years of shared history. What felt important was the commitment to honest examination rather than to quick resolution, the willingness to sit with discomfort and uncertainty, rather than rushing toward premature conclusions that might feel satisfying in the moment, but would ultimately fail to address underlying issues. As Sunday evening progressed toward night, I found myself standing once again at the windows overlooking Central Park, watching the city lights emerge against the darkening sky. The view was familiar from countless evenings throughout the years I had lived in this apartment, but my relationship to it felt fundamentally altered by everything that had happened since the promotion party. I was no longer observing from behind the protective concealment of anonymity, no longer managing the careful performance of being less than I actually was. The exposure felt raw and sometimes uncomfortable, but it also carried a quality of authenticity and alignment that had been absent throughout the years of strategic concealment. Whatever emerged from the current crisis, I would face it as my complete self rather than as the edited version I had been presenting to the world and to my husband for far too long. The beginning of the second week brought a shift in energy as the initial shock of revelation began settling into something more manageable, though no less complex. Monday morning arrived with the publication of Jennifer Chen's profile piece in the Wall Street Journal, a comprehensive examination of my background and emergence from anonymity that would shape public perception of my story for months to come. I read the article carefully over breakfast, noting with appreciation how Jennifer had balanced factual reporting with nuanced understanding of the psychological dimensions involved in navigating inherited wealth and concealed identity within an intimate relationship. The piece opened with vivid description of the promotion party revelation, using the dramatic scene to draw readers into the broader narrative about my life and choices. Jennifer had woven together information from our interview with additional reporting from conversations she had apparently conducted with several board members, with Catherine Morrison, and with industry analysts who provided context about Meridian's performance under my ownership. The resulting portrait was generally fair and even sympathetic, presenting my anonymity as understandable response to legitimate concerns rather than as manipulative deception designed to harm or exploit. The article did not shy away from examining the complications my choices had created, particularly regarding Daniel's situation, and the questions raised about whether concealing such fundamental information from a spouse could ever be justified regardless of motivations. Jennifer had included brief quotes from an ethics professor at Columbia Business School who offered perspectives on the tension between personal autonomy and marital transparency, noting that while individuals had rights to privacy even within marriage, the extent of my concealment raised difficult questions about the boundaries of acceptable information management in intimate partnerships. What struck me most forcefully about the profile was how Jennifer had captured the essential loneliness that accompanied my years of anonymity, the isolation that came from constantly monitoring what I revealed and maintaining rigid separation between different aspects of my identity. She had written with particular insight about the toll this division took over time, the way that living as two separate people gradually eroded sense of integrated self and created exhaustion that extended beyond simple practical burden of managing logistics. Reading her description of my experience reflected back to me helped crystallize recognition that whatever else had motivated the promotion party revelation, part of what had driven me toward that dramatic disclosure was simply unsustainability of continuing to maintain such comprehensive concealment. The article generated immediate response across social media and professional networks, with thousands of people sharing the piece and offering commentary that ranged from supportive to critical to deeply personal accounts of their own experiences navigating wealth, power, and authentic relationships. The volume of engagement surprised me despite having anticipated significant public interest. The story apparently resonated with concerns that extended well beyond the specific circumstances of corporate ownership and marital deception to touch on broader questions about identity, authenticity, and the challenges of being fully known in relationships where significant imbalances existed. Catherine Morrison called mid-morning to discuss the article and its immediate impact on Meridian's stakeholder relationships. She reported that the overall response from business partners and industry contacts had been more positive than we might have expected, with many people expressing respect for my leadership capabilities and understanding of my reasons for maintaining anonymity. However, she also noted some concern from investors and clients about whether my revealed identity would lead to changes in governance or strategy that might affect the company's direction and performance. These concerns would need to be addressed through careful communications and through demonstrated continuity in how Meridian operated despite the dramatic personal revelations about ownership. We discussed plans for my gradually increased public presence in corporate contexts, recognizing that while immediate high visibility might create disruption, some strategic appearances at industry events and stakeholder meetings would help establish my credibility as visible leader, rather than as shadowy figure whose capabilities remained uncertain despite nominal ownership position. Catherine suggested starting with the upcoming quarterly earnings presentation to analysts, where I could participate alongside her in discussing company performance and strategic direction. The appearance would signal confidence and competence, while also demonstrating that Meridian's leadership remained stable despite revelations about my previously concealed role. After concluding the call with Catherine, I turned attention to the task Daniel and I had agreed to undertake during our Sunday evening conversation. Finding an appropriate couples therapist required careful consideration of expertise, approach, and practical logistics. I spent several hours researching practitioners who specialized in relationships involving significant power imbalances, wealth dynamics, and patterns of disrespect or dismissiveness that had become normalized over time. The search led me to Dr. Patricia Williams, a psychologist with extensive experience working with high-net-worth couples navigating complex relationship challenges, while also managing public visibility and professional pressures. I contacted Dr. Williams' office and explained the nature of our situation in general terms, noting that recent public revelations had created crisis in my marriage that required professional guidance to navigate effectively. The intake coordinator indicated that Dr. Williams had limited availability but that given the urgency and complexity of the circumstances, she would be willing to schedule an initial consultation for later in the week. I confirmed the appointment and then contacted Daniel to inform him of the arrangement, receiving his agreement to participate in the Thursday afternoon session. Tuesday brought an unexpected development when Robert Chun requested a private meeting to discuss matters related to Daniel's employment situation. We arranged to meet at a discreet restaurant rather than at Meridian's offices, both of us recognizing that visible consultation between the company's owner and the direct supervisor of her husband would generate speculation that served no productive purpose. Robert arrived looking uncomfortable with the conversation ahead, clearly uncertain about how to balance his professional responsibilities with sensitivity to the personal dimensions of the situation. He began by explaining that Daniel had met with him on Monday morning as previously scheduled, and that the conversation had been difficult for both of them given the dramatic changes in context that had occurred since Daniel's promotion just 2 weeks earlier. Daniel had indicated that he was struggling with the professional implications of remaining at Meridian, while his wife owned the company, and while his colleagues all knew about the relationship dynamics that had been revealed at the promotion party. Robert described Daniel as uncertain about whether he could continue to be effective in his role, given these changed circumstances, and given his concerns about whether future career advancement would be seen as merit-based or as resulting from spousal influence. Robert then shared his own perspective on the situation, noting that while he understood Daniel's discomfort, from a purely professional standpoint there was no reason for Daniel to leave his position. His performance had been consistently strong prior to the recent revelations, and his work during the previous 2 weeks, though limited by his taking personal leave, showed no signs of diminishment in capability or judgment. Robert expressed concern that if Daniel resigned or requested transfer, the move might be interpreted as evidence that his previous accomplishments had not been entirely legitimate, or that he lacked confidence in his ability to succeed without special treatment. I listened carefully to Robert's assessment, and then asked directly what he was hoping to achieve through our conversation. Was he seeking my guidance about how to manage Daniel's employment, or was he providing me with information that he thought I needed in order to understand the professional implications of my personal situation? Robert acknowledged that he was doing both, recognizing that Daniel's potential departure would create operational challenges for the division, while also understanding that I had personal stake in how these matters unfolded. I responded by reiterating the guidance I had provided to Catherine the previous week. Daniel's career decisions should be managed based entirely on what made sense for him professionally and for Meridian operationally, without any consideration of my personal relationship with him. If he wanted to resign or transfer for his own reasons, those decisions should be respected and accommodated appropriately. However, if Robert's assessment was that Daniel should remain in his current role because he was performing well, and because departure would send problematic signals about the legitimacy of his previous achievements, then Robert should communicate that perspective clearly to Daniel and encourage him to stay. Robert appeared somewhat relieved by this clear direction, noting that it aligned with his own inclination but that he had been uncertain about whether advocating for Daniel to remain at Meridian might be seen as insensitive to my situation, or as failing to recognize the complications created by the public revelations. I assured him that my priority was for the company to make sound operational decisions, and for Daniel to have the space to make choices that served his professional development, without feeling pressured in either direction by concerns about my reaction, or about how others might interpret his decisions. The conversation with Robert led me to deeper reflection about the multiple layers of complication that my concealment strategy had created. By hiding my ownership of Meridian from Daniel, I had not only introduced fundamental dishonesty into our marriage, but had also created professional entanglements that now required careful management to prevent either unfair advantage or unfair disadvantage for him. The situation illustrated how personal decisions could generate consequences that extended far beyond intimate relationship to affect careers, organizations, and networks of professional relationships that had nothing to do with the original concerns that motivated the deception. Wednesday brought the first couples counseling session with Dr. Patricia Williams, moved up from Thursday at her suggestion after I had provided more detailed background about the situation during a preliminary phone consultation. Daniel and I met at her office in Midtown Manhattan, arriving separately and greeting each other with awkward formality that reflected the strange territory we were navigating between married intimacy and potential dissolution. The office itself was designed to promote comfort and openness, with neutral colors, comfortable seating arranged to facilitate conversation rather than confrontation, and an overall atmosphere that managed to feel professional while avoiding the clinical coldness that sometimes characterized therapeutic settings. Dr. Williams began by establishing ground rules for our work together, and by explaining her approach to couples therapy, which emphasized understanding patterns rather than assigning blame, and focused on each partner taking responsibility for their own contributions to relationship difficulties. She noted that the dramatic circumstances that had brought us to therapy were unusual, but that the underlying dynamics of dismissiveness, concealment, and failed mutual recognition were actually quite common in relationships where significant imbalances existed in power, resources, or social status. She asked each of us to describe our understanding of what had led to the current crisis, inviting us to speak without interruption while the other partner listened. Daniel spoke first, offering an account that showed more self-awareness than I had observed in our private conversations. He acknowledged having consistently underestimated my capabilities and having treated my perspectives as less valuable than they deserved, attributing these patterns to his own insecurities about his achievements and his need to position himself as the authority figure in our relationship. He described feeling shocked and humiliated by the promotion party revelation, but also recognized that the humiliation stemmed primarily from public exposure of his own attitudes and behaviors rather than from anything I had done to him maliciously. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.